Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 61 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Montreal Canadiens, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So in the first game of the post-Timo Meier era, the San Jose Sharks will lose in regulation with a grand total of just 1 goal. Now, this is not technically the first game that the Sharks are playing without Timo Meier this season, because he did miss the previous 3 with a half injury, half preparing for trade situation, but it is the first one that he's not on the roster entirely. Interestingly enough, a funny coincidence, the first game of Timo Meier's career, all the way back in the 16-17 season, came against these very same Montreal Canadiens, and now the first game in which the Sharks are playing without Timo Meier on the main roster is also against Montreal, which for a team in the Eastern Conference who the Sharks only see twice per year is quite the coincidence. Now, with that Timo Meier trade, it kind of marks a clear direction for the San Jose Sharks that they are going to be rebuilding for the foreseeable future. Back at the beginning of the season, I made a video asking the question of whether or not the San Jose Sharks were tanking in the 22-23 season, but I couldn't really take any real sort of plan that the Sharks were making, and instead I just looked at the players that they added and the players they subtracted and asked the question of whether or not they got worse during that off season going into the year. And the answer that I came to was yes, indeed, they got worse, and so you could say that they were tanking. And that ended up being the case, as the Sharks last year, they finished 11th last. This year, they're currently 4th last with potential to move downwards. But like I said, you couldn't necessarily say that they were tanking with absolute certainty. But with the Meier trade, you don't trade a superstar, or at least an elite 26-year-old in the middle of the prime of his career player, and only acquire back like mostly future prospects and picks if you aren't going for that rebuild. So while I will continue to review these games with the sort of idea that winning is good and losing is bad, just because otherwise what is the point, I will be keeping an eye on the actual real race in the standings, which is the race for last place, over the last quarter of this season, as you can see here. So taking a look at that, with the Sharks losing in regulation, they stand pat at 48 points. The team directly above them, the Arizona Coyotes, who were potentially threatening for that 4th last spot, were winners tonight against the Chicago Blackhawks in regulation. As such, they jump up to 51 points with a game in hand on San Jose, while the Blackhawks stay at 47, also with a game in hand. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the standings, the Blue Jackets, who seemingly had that last place spot locked down, were winners tonight in Buffalo, and as such have jumped up to 46 points, meaning the San Jose Sharks at this point have a very real possibility of even going into last place. It will be tough. It will require a lot of losses and the Blue Jackets to actually win some games, but you never know. However, finally moving on to this actual game, the San Jose Sharks in their previous matchup against the Montreal Canadiens did get a shutout victory, and it looked like they were heading in a similar direction here tonight. They start this game off with a Jacob McDonald goal, his first of the season, his first as a San Jose Shark, just a couple of minutes in, and that would be the only scoring for the rest of the first period and for the entirety of the second period as well. However, not for a lack of chances. While the Canadiens did get a couple of chances themselves, in which Kaapo Kähkönen had to make a couple of nice saves on, it was the Sharks getting a ton of opportunities onto Jake Allen, and with some just not correct bounces going their way, as well as some incredible saves from Jake Allen, the Sharks could never really add to that 1-goal lead that they had moving into the third period. Now, like I said, with the first matchup against the Canadiens being a shutout, the Sharks were now going 5 periods having shut out the Canadiens this season with only 1 remaining. Would the Sharks be able to hold on? Well, not so much, as Kaden Ghouli would be able to tie this game up at 1, and then very soon after, Ylonen would make it 2-1 and suddenly turn a Sharks lead into a Sharks deficit, and they could never manage to get that game-tying goal. They would try to pull the goaltender, but they couldn't seem to get it settled in the offensive zone. It felt as though they were really missing some sort of player with a killer instinct shot on not only the power play, but also in that 6-on-5 situation, and as such, Dvorak ends up with the empty netter with just a few seconds left in the game, and the Sharks lose it 3-1 in a game that they actually played rather well. In terms of actually high danger chances, the Sharks had 19 of them, while the Canadiens only had 5, very reminiscent of their game a few days ago, or a couple weeks ago, against the Seattle Kraken, which was a shutout victory for San Jose, but without the bounces and with the couple of mistakes that allowed Ghouli and Ylonen to score, the Sharks are regulation losers here tonight. On to the players to talk about. Obviously, there are two names that really jump off the board here, but let us start off with the first line of Eyssimont, Couture, and Barabanov, who I definitely felt were the best line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Eyssimont, I thought, had yet another fantastic game for himself, just continuing to out-battle pretty much all of the other team's players when on the ice. It's just, there are situations where Eyssimont has it, and you're thinking, okay, he's not going to be able to make anything happen here, and yet he'll just outwork his man in that situation and get a decent pass off or a decent shot off. He isn't the most skilled player, and this is obviously very clear having watched him through these first the bunch of games that he has played for the San Jose Sharks, but he is an extremely hard worker, like I've mentioned time and time again, and that allows him to really shine in these games. I thought he had a fantastic game, and also his other winger on the line, Barabanov, I also thought looked quite good here tonight. So that was a quick word on the first line, but obviously it is the second line that is really the interesting thing here tonight, because in that Timo Meier trade, yes, they acquired Mukhamadullin, a first-round pick, a conditional first-round pick, but they also acquired two potential roster players. Obviously, the big one would be Fabian Zetterlund, but the other was Andreas Johnson, who was essentially a cap dump from the New Jersey Devils. He had basically zero room to be on their main roster, only played 2 games thus far this season, but immediately inserts himself into the lineup here for the San Jose Sharks, and they both find themselves being centered by Tomas Hertl. So clearly a decent spot to be in the lineup. And how did they do? Well, it was okay. I don't think either of these two players were particularly bad. Let us start with Andreas Johnson. He did get a couple of very good chances here in the early parts of this game, so that was nice to see. But in a general sort of was he good type of situation, not amazing. We'll see exactly if it's an issue of not being able to gel immediately with a new team, a new system, and everything of that nature. But at the moment, it wasn't necessarily the most impressive game. But of course, Johnson was expected to be the cap dump. I wasn't necessarily expecting a ton of things from him. He's not necessarily in the future plans for the San Jose Sharks past this season. The player who is likely in the future plans for the Sharks past this season is the other winger on the line, Fabian Zetterlund, at 23 years old. He seems to have that perfect age to fit into the San Jose Sharks rebuilding window. And so how did he play? Well, a lot of New Jersey fans like to say that he was a sort of an extremely hardworking player. Oh, you're going to love him instantly. And the player who I had originally compared to when I was discussing the trade was Barabanov, just based on his point totals. However, it seemed as though he was leaning more towards like a Evgeny Svechnikov, Oscar Lindblom type of play compared to an Alex Barabanov type of play. Barabanov obviously is able to make some stuff happen on the ice, has got some pretty slick hands, some decent moves, which makes him a pretty good top 6 player, even if it's more of a second liner. I didn't really see much of that from Zetterlund. Now, the one thing that I will say, he definitely stuck out, which was that he had like a piece of his equipment sticking out the back of his pants. I don't know if that's like an actual thing that he wanted to do, or if that's just happened to be the case here tonight, but it was immediately noticeable while on the ice each and every time. And watching him, there wasn't necessarily a ton of impressive things. There was one like really nice wand battle where you're thinking like, oh, is he going to be able to outmuscle so many players? But then like in the third period, he had like a potential breakaway where he's against the Montreal Canadiens defender and he was unable to outmuscle him in that situation. So it's not necessarily a super consistent thing. We never really got to see much of a shot away from him. We never really got that opportunity. He did have a couple of chances similar to Andreas Johnson in this game, but nothing that you were thinking like, oh wow, what a great job for him to create that for himself. So instead of being that Alex Barabanov, oh, he could be a very good second liner or a pretty good second liner, he looks more like, oh, he could be a decent third liner. Again, like I said with Johnson, it's a first game on a new team in a new environment, going to be very difficult to adjust, so I'm not going to draw any amazing conclusions from that, but not necessarily the best start for these two players, but it was okay enough. On to the third line, we had Bonino, Sturm, and Svechnikov, as remained a line here tonight because of how impressive they were in the previous game. And here tonight, a bit of a step back for sure, I would say. Svechnikov not nearly as noticeable as he has been in each of the past few games, or in almost each of the past few games, which is not a surprise. Nobody was obviously expecting Svechnikov to suddenly put up a goal in every single game that he would play, but still, it is noticeable to say. And then when it comes to Sturm and Bonino, they are always kind of hit or miss in some of these games. Some games they'll really show up. Well, at least with Nico Sturm, some games he'll really show up and be strong, and others not so much. While with Nick Bonino, it's less likely to be strong, but it does occasionally happen. One thing to mention for Nick Bonino is that with the departure of Timo Meier, Nick Bonino now finds himself in 6-on-5 situations and in power play situations. And like I mentioned earlier on, those things did not work particularly well for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Obviously, Nick Bonino does not have near the offensive capabilities of Timo Meier, nowhere near the level of shot or killer instinct that Meier did have. So it's going to be a significantly notable drop-off for the power play for the San Jose Sharks that already wasn't all that great. When it comes to the fourth line, we did not have the L line once again. Lindblom and Lorentz were joined by Gregor, and that is not because LeBanc was a healthy scratch, as you might be expecting, but actually because his wife gave birth to a kid for them, a child, and as such, LeBanc obviously not going to be playing here tonight in that situation, and so this is a bit of a new look fourth line, I guess you could say. I actually did appreciate Gregor's game here tonight. I thought he was pretty good, and Lindblom wasn't terrible, but otherwise there wasn't too much to write home about for this fourth line. When it comes to the defensive pairings, we saw a new look on the first pairing. No surprise, of course, because Harrington was traded in that Timo Meier deal. Karlsson is joined by Ferraro, and you would think that this pairing would work quite well. Obviously, the big year that Ferraro had, which was back in 2021, was when he was on a pairing with Brent Burns, and Erik Karlsson, a pretty similar player to that, very offensive first, and so you're expecting Ferraro to kind of hang back, and I thought Ferraro definitely in the early parts of this game started off rather well. A couple of issues later on where you're thinking like he needs to be a bit more defensively responsible, because you know Erik Karlsson is going to be pinching up, you know he's going to be very aggressive, and so I think Ferraro was just somewhat not prepared for that, maybe because so much this season he has been playing with other kind of defensive types of players, even though recently it's been with McDonald, who's kind of a bit more like Erik Karlsson. But there were a couple of issues in the later parts of this game. You take a look at the Ylonen goal. This was definitely a mistake from Erik Karlsson in the neutral zone, steps up in a situation where he shouldn't be. Ferraro unable to get back on the back check in that situation to beat out Ylonen, who ends up getting this pass from Pitlick to score that goal. And then also in a later point, a similar situation where Ferraro is a bit too far forward, pinching in the offensive zone while Karlsson is already rather deep, which allowed a chance the other way for the Canadiens again. So it was a decent start for Ferraro, but hopefully can find a bit more chemistry moving forward. When it comes to Erik Karlsson, though, I did think Karlsson had a very good game, a lot of solid chances for himself, was making some great passes, but again, big thing about Erik Karlsson being able to put up so many points thus far this season, it was kind of a two-way street. Yes, Timo Meier benefited from having Erik Karlsson, which is why he managed to put up those 30 goals. But Karlsson also benefited heavily from having a player to pass to like Meier, who had such a great shot that he could give Karlsson all of these assists. Here tonight, while there were a lot of those great plays, none of them ended up in the back of the net. The other player who I do actually want to mention here would also be Vlasic. I thought Vlasic actually had a pretty solid game, not only defensively but offensively as well, was making a couple of nice plays. And then there was also Radim Šimek. So when Harrington got traded, I was thinking, okay, who's going to come into the lineup to replace him? Probably Nick Cicek. I had honestly completely forgotten about Radim Šimek, who had been injured for such a long period of time and was not even that particularly impressive before he was injured, that it just didn't really cross my mind. But he does return to the lineup here tonight, and I thought Šimek had a pretty decent game. Nothing amazing, but Šimek is not really an amazing player, so for him, it was quite good. And then finally, to talk about the goaltender here tonight, Kaapo Kähkönen, he really did have a strong start to this game. The first two periods, while he wasn't tested a ton, he was still tested, and he made some very, very nice saves. The Ylonen one, he also had absolutely no chance on. The only one that you can definitely fault him for would be the Kaden Ghouli goal, which you could say was the difference maker here tonight, as this one goes straight through the 5-hole. Kähkönen unable to locate this puck in time to be able to close that part of him down. But still, you only let in 2 goals. This was a very good night for Kaapo Kähkönen for sure, continuing a string of good performances for him. It's just only 1 goal of goal support. You're not going to win too many games like that. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the St. Louis Blues, a team who is also not in a playoff spot, which is, kind of weird to say for St. Louis, who seemingly has been a perennial playoff team as of late, but they have sold out. They've traded O'Reilly, they've traded Tarasenko, so it'll be interesting to see how that game goes. Class dismissed.